Welcome to Stories of Change. Over the years, I have become fascinated by stories, not because they tell us what happened, but because they help us understand why it happened. In this series, I share stories from history, business, science, education, and sometimes unexpected places. Together, we explore the lessons hidden inside them and what they can teach us about change, leadership, human behavior, innovation, and adaptation. The story is interesting. The pattern is useful. The lesson is where the value lives. So let's begin. Today's story is about lecturers, or perhaps more accurately, why lecturers did not disappear. Because if you think about it, they probably should have. Imagine walking into one of the world's oldest universities, perhaps Bologna, perhaps Oxford, perhaps Paris. The year is somewhere around the 13th century. The room is cold, the light is poor, the shelves are sparse, and some of the books are chained to desks. Not because librarians were difficult people, because books were incredibly valuable. A manuscript could take months, sometimes years, to produce. Copied by hand, page by page, line by line. Knowledge was not abundant. Knowledge was scarce. And scarcity changes everything. It shapes institutions, it shapes behavior, it shapes roles. And in medieval universities, it shaped the role of the lecturer. The original lecturer was not really teaching in the way we think about teaching today. The word lecture comes from the Latin word lectura. It means to read. The lecturer literally read from one of the few available texts while students copied notes. The lecturer was not primarily interpreting. The lecturer was not facilitating. The lecturer was not provoking discussion. The lecturer was distributing knowledge. In many ways, the original lecturer was a human audiobook, a human photocopier, if you like, a human knowledge distribution system. And before any academics listening to this episode start writing to me, I promise you the story becomes more flattering from here. Because then something happened, something that should have changed everything. Around the middle of the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg introduced the printing press. Books became easier to produce. Costs fell. Access expanded. Knowledge started escaping the walls of monasteries and universities. The original scarcity was beginning to disappear. And this is where the story becomes interesting. Because if lecturers existed because books were scarce, surely lecturers should have disappeared when books became more available. They did not. In fact, something unexpected happened. They evolved. The lecturer stopped being primarily a reader. The lecturer became an interpreter, a commentator, a guide. Someone who could help students make sense of ideas rather than simply access them. And I think there is a broader lesson hidden in that. When technology changes, value rarely disappears. It migrates. The printing press did not eliminate the need for people who understood ideas. It changed where they created value. And as books became more common, information was no longer the scarce resource. Insight became the scarce resource. The role evolved again. During the Renaissance and in the Age of Reason, universities became places where ideas were debated, challenged, tested, and expanded. The lecturer became more than a transmitter of knowledge. The lecturer became a contributor to knowledge. A researcher, a thinker, a challenger. Someone expected to add to humanity's understanding of the world. The lecturer survived not because nothing changed. The lecturer survived because the role kept adapting to what was becoming scarce. When books were scarce, lecturers distributed knowledge. When information became easier to access, lecturers provided interpretation. When understanding became more important, lecturers generated new insights. When complexity exploded, lecturers helped students make sense of it. The role kept moving, the scarcity kept changing. One of my favorite observations comes from Alfred North Whitehead, who once wrote, "A merely well-informed man is the most useless bore on God's earth." It is a wonderfully brutal line, but perhaps his point was that information alone has never been enough. Even when books became widely available, people still needed help making sense of what they were reading. Knowledge became easier to access. Understanding remained hard. What is fascinating, though, is that while the scarcity kept changing, many of the rituals remained remarkably stable. One person at the front, rows of students, a timetable, a lecture theatre. Sometimes I wonder whether a medieval scholar would be more surprised by how familiar some modern lecture theatres still look. That is not a criticism. It is simply a reminder. Systems often outlive the constraints that created them, and yet relationships matter. Despite any technological shift, students still seem to seek something from lectures that goes beyond information. I say this with some affection because I spent a few years lecturing myself. And what I remember most is not simply the content I delivered. It was the relationship with the students. The moment someone understood an idea differently, the question that shifted the room, the quiet confidence that appeared when a student realized they could think their way through something. Encouragement, challenge, perspective, belief. Sometimes simply the feeling that somebody further along the journey is helping us make sense of our own journey. And perhaps that never fully disappears. Then came more waves of change. Libraries, mass education, radio, television, the internet, search engines, Wikipedia, YouTube, online learning, and now artificial intelligence. Imagine a student sitting in a lecture theatre today. Laptop open, phone nearby, artificial intelligence available with a few keystrokes. More information available in seconds than entire medieval universities possessed. Explanations are becoming abundant. Summaries are becoming abundant. Feedback is becoming abundant. Tutoring is becoming abundant. Knowledge itself is becoming increasingly accessible. Which makes me wonder, if knowledge is becoming abundant, what becomes scarce next? Perhaps judgment, perhaps discernment, perhaps wisdom, perhaps the ability to ask better questions, perhaps the ability to think critically about information rather than simply consume it. As I was reflecting on this story, I found myself returning to a line from T.S. Eliot. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Nearly a century later, that question feels more relevant than ever. Because if artificial intelligence is making knowledge easier to access, perhaps the challenge is no longer access. Perhaps the challenge is judgment. Perhaps the challenge is helping people navigate uncertainty. Perhaps the lecturer evolves again, not as the gatekeeper of knowledge, not as the sole source of information, but as someone who helps students develop judgment, someone who helps students think critically, someone who helps students navigate a world overflowing with information. The higher education thinker Ronald Barnett argues that universities increasingly operate in a world of uncertainty and complexity. a world where answers matter less than our ability to navigate ambiguity. If that is true, perhaps the lecturer evolves again. History suggests this wouldn't be the first time a profession has adapted to changing scarcity. Take the scribes. When the printing press arrived, many people assumed scribes simply disappeared. Some did, but many adapted. They became printers, editors, publishers, translators, scholars. The work changed, the capability did not disappear, the value migrated. History suggests that when scarcity changes, humans adapt. Not perfectly, not immediately, but eventually. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside this story. The lecture was not originally a teaching method. It was a response to scarcity. Then it became something else, and then something else again. Books changed the scarcity. Printing changed the scarcity. Libraries changed the scarcity. The internet changed the scarcity. And now artificial intelligence may be changing it again. The story is not really about lecturers. It is about a question every profession eventually faces. What becomes valuable when the thing that once made you valuable becomes easy to access? Stay curious. The story is interesting. The pattern is useful. The lesson is where the value lives. Until next time.